And I'm alive and I'm awake as well. Thank you to Jordan Page for bringing us into another episode of Double Cross Radio. We have a special guest tonight, and I'm going to go right to the introduction. And I'm going to have you can unmute your microphone now. And I'm getting a little echo here. What's happening? Let's see. Is that testing? No, it's not working there. Are you connected to UCY there, Mary?
I see it up, but I don't know what connected. How I would tell if it was connected.
I'm getting an echo. It's gone now, so it's okay. That's good. Okay. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
We have from time to time slight little interruptions like that. My guest tonight is Dr. Mary J. Ruwart. She's a research scientist, ethicist, and libertarian author and activist. She has a BS in biochemistry and a Ph.D. in biophysics, both from Michigan State University, which recently beat University of Oregon in a very close football game. But who cares about sports? There's more important things in life. And then she joined the Department of Surgery at St. Louis University, and from there, she left an assistant professorship to accept a position with Upjohn, and she worked as a senior research scientist involved in developing new therapies for a variety of diseases, including liver cirrhosis and AIDS. And since 1982, she's been involved in societal ethics with a focus on political theory and the practice of libertarianism. Her award-winning international best-selling book, Healing Our World, demonstrates how ethical application of libertarian principles has historically created harmony and abundance. And we can't say that enough. Referencing hundreds of studies, Dr. Ruwart demonstrates that many of our current policies surreptitiously violate the basic ethical standards that we hold dear, thereby leading to unintended and highly undesirable consequences. And I have read a couple chapters of your book that are available online, and I was just spellbound. I was late for work one day because I was busy reading. It's an excellent book. I would, you can do some reading online or whatever. I would just buy a copy so you always have one handy, as you never know when the internet's going to go down or something's going to be taken off and you can't see it anymore. And that's something you'd want to have in your library because it's. So when did you first publish that? It was in the 1990s, wasn't it?
That's right, 1992. And I have to share with you that the reason it's so well written is my sister Marty was my editor, and I would send her copies of the manuscript, and she'd send it back with more red ink than black ink. So it took us a while, but the flow started coming, and at least it doesn't read like a science book.
Yeah, I think writing is a skill just like, everything else. And sometimes those of us who are good in one area like science maybe don't have that writing skill. I don't know that, but regardless, I think it reads like a story. But it's full of facts, and it's, as far as I can tell, they're true facts, and they're things that written back in 1992, they're still true today. This is 23 years later. And I'm sure they're going to be through 23 years in the future because, the truth never changes. It's an amazing book, and I think as we go through the show tonight, I think you'll see that she has an abundance of knowledge of many, many subjects. And I think all the research you've done for this book probably has led to just knowledge on almost every subject about the encroachment on our liberties and whatever. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, when I started the book, I thought it would be a book about theory, and then I thought I'd get a few real-life examples of how liberty worked in the real world, and what I found is almost everything that libertarians propose has been done somewhere in the real world and has been shown to work very well. So I got very excited about that, and every time I've done an update on Healing Our World, and of course the last one just came out a couple months ago, every time I've done an update, it's just amazing to me how much information is out there, because when I first put this out in 92, I figured I had probably covered about 80% of the studies showing how liberty works in the real world. And I can't even begin to scratch the surface anymore, because there's so much out there showing that if you want to enrich the poor or protect the environment, deter crime or diffuse terrorism.
I cannot argue with that at all. One of the things that, well, you just posted it today, I believe. It was about the $750 pill.
Yes.
This is an amazing story, and this whole story would not be possible without the intervention of government. It wouldn't happen. Why don't you relate that to our listeners? This is a great story.
Yeah, well, the high price of pharmaceuticals is related to the fact that we have so much regulation of them. And in the particular case we're talking about with this Daraprim, what it is, it's an old drug. It came out in the 1950s, and it's used for an indication, a parasitic infection, basically, that isn't very prominent. Maybe 13,000 people a year require the drug. So only one manufacturer is making it. And it was actually sold twice in the last 5 years. The first time it was sold, it went from $1 a pill to $13.50, even though I don't think there was any new work done on it or anything. And then when Turing Pharmaceuticals bought it, they upped the price from $13.50 to $7.50. And of course, in a normal
when she says $750, she means $750.
That's right, $750. Yes, thank you. Let's make that clear. In a free market, what would happen is some competitor would come along and say, "Hey, I can make it and I'll sell it for $500." But what prevents them from doing that is that even though it's a generic drug, you still have to go through some FDA approval process, and that process takes a few years, and it takes millions of dollars, maybe tens of millions, and the entire market for this drug in recent times has been about $10 million a year. So you can see that there's some problems with the numbers there. So probably
even if they were able to go out there and get through all the testing and start to market it and make some kind of return on their investment, what's to say that the person that owns is also able to produce it won't just drop his price, and now all of a sudden you're not selling any pills at all. So it'd be a real risky venture for someone to compete with this, because you can't just go out there and make it. You have to do all this other stuff too, which costs a lot of money.
That's right. And what's happening now is many of these drugs, of course, they were put on the market before the FDA got its teeth in 1962. So what the FDA is doing now for companies that take one of these drugs, these old generic drugs, and they jump it through part of the process, especially if it's like an orphan drug. In other words, it's a drug that doesn't have a very big patient population. The FDA lets them abbreviate that program so it doesn't cost them quite so much, and then they give them a monopoly. It's not a patent monopoly, it's just a monopoly on basically that disease and any treatment for that disease for a number of years. And I think it differs for every drug. So it could be 3 to, I think the highest one I may have heard of is 7 years, 3 to 7 years, something like that. And then what happens is the drug manufacturer, of course, has a total monopoly and just really raises the price high, very much like you're seeing Turing do.
Yeah, there's we also had a show a while back where we had Stefan Kinsella on talking about intellectual property laws, and he brought up a point, and I didn't have time to research this again today, but I think it was the Netherlands, they abolished intellectual properties on pharmaceuticals, and they had more new drugs introduced, and valuable drugs, life-saving drugs introduced into the marketplace in a single year than they had in any 5-year period because of that. It really stimulates innovation.
Yes. Back when I joined the Upjohn Company in the mid-'70s, we were still developing a few drugs without patents. Our upper management would listen if we said, hey, here's this wonderful thing we could put on the market. It doesn't have a patent, but, we think we could get a good market share just because of all the good work we do around it. But, just a few years after I joined the company, they changed that policy. And that's because in 1962, regulations came on board that really gave the FDA an incredible amount of power. So what was happening is before the 62 amendments, as they're called, it took about 4.5 years for a drug to get from the lab bench to the marketplace. By the end of I'd say about 2000, it had come to 14 years. In other words, it added 10 years to the development time. And when the AIDS patients, for example, were waiting for the first new pharmaceuticals, they were dying waiting. So what they did is they hired black market chemists and made the drugs themselves. And everybody who wanted them, by the time the FDA gave the pharmaceutical companies permission to test them in people, everybody who wanted them had already had them and was resistant. So we had to wait for new people to be diagnosed before we could even run our tests. And you can't blame them. And if you saw Dallas Buyers Club, the award-winning movie, what you saw was that oftentimes the FDA would come after these people and shut them down. Not always. There was a group in California they didn't mess with, but if you were out there doing it on your own, they'd come after you and take your drug supplies and your vitamin supplies and everything away from you, and as you saw in the movie, drag you into court.
That's right. That was a true story. That was our compassionate government that's out there for your best interest and there to save you, and they just made his life a living hell. The last years of his life anyway. He was just trying to stay alive, and he found a way to finance it by helping other people, that's how free markets work. You prosper in as much as you help people, and government just didn't like that at all.
That's right. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Chuck, but I think your listeners would want to know. Cancer patients actually sued the FDA a few years ago because they wanted to take drugs that had been tested in people and were known to be safe, or at least sort of safe. No cancer drug is really safe. But hadn't been tested for effectiveness. And they sued on the grounds that the Constitution promised them, a right to life. And the court said that no, that wasn't true. There was no constitutional right for Americans to save their lives with unapproved drugs.
That's really, there's a show that we did in the past about Dr. Brzezinski down in Houston.
Oh, yes.
You may know of him. He's not just a quack out there. He was doing some biochemistry research, and he discovered these substances in some people that were absent in other people, and then he's found a kind of an empirical correlation that the people that had them were healthier, had less problems health-wise, and fewer cancers. And so he started to test putting this into people with cancer to see what would happen, and he found that if they got the dosage high enough, it made it shrunk the size of the tumors, and he was only getting people to work with that they'd been given like weeks or months to live, and he was completely healing about 30% of them, which was just, no one could believe it.
Yes, and think about it. The government hounded him.
Put him in prison.
Yeah, well, and at least they tried. And of course, it costs about a new drug, a new entity like that, what we call a new chemical entity, or it costs about $1.2 billion in actual money. And, that 14 years, it's down to 12 now, I think. But, so there's all this money and time you have to put in. And, no doctor can afford that, right? So the FDA doesn't like to work with individual doctors if they have something like this. And it's a real shame because they've made such a case out of Brzezinski that if you were a doctor and you had an idea that might cure cancer, you would be a little frightened of using it. It's really discouraging people who might have ideas from going that route.
Yeah, if it really hadn't been for the way the system has developed, cancer may be unknown by this time in our, in our growth as a people. We might have had enough innovation and new ideas and creating better products that they could have completely wiped it out. We'll never know because we can't go back in time and change things. But it certainly seems that it slows down the innovation anytime they've lifted even parts of the regulations and processes that keep things slowed down and kind of stuck in molasses. We see a real quickening of new products and actually people cooperating, collaborating to bring out better products to help people. They know that's in their best interest. There's a lot of money to be made just by being the guy that did it first. You become an authority. You become the guy. You become Coca-Cola instead of Pepsi. It's important.
Yes.
You don't always. I really used to really believe in patents. I don't anymore, as you can probably tell.
Well, I have several patents, and I can tell you that there's a lot of gamemanship involved in getting them. And even the patent office, everything's so conflicted. They started patenting genes for a while, and then they decided they weren't going to do that anymore. So everything's kind of in limbo. So it's just really hard to define the limits of an idea, and it just doesn't work out the way most libertarians think about it in terms of intellectual property. So I think having gone through the process, I would say that it's just not workable.
Now, one of the things I read, and I think this was from chapter 6, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But you were talking about when you had moved from a university setting into the I guess we call it the private practice, or not private sector, the Upjohn Company, that you were amazed at how much more cooperation and teamwork was involved and people sharing ideas, and there was less of this trying to, I guess, competitiveness. There's still a little bit of competitiveness for budgets, but there was a lot more people working together than there were in the public universities.
Right, because we rise and fall together. We need to get new drugs developed and out the door for us all to be successful. Because if the company isn't making money, none of us will make money. So we have a great incentive to cooperate. And when I was in academia and I used to interview, I used to say, how much sabotage do you get from your colleagues? And nobody thought that was a strange question, which is pretty sad. I think it's different today in universities, and part of the reason is that science has gotten so specialized, it's very difficult to execute a project without having some collaborators. You need people who have certain specialties so you can actually do the experiment you want to do. So I think that's improved, but still, it's a very different
I think there's still some sabotage going on.
I'm sorry to hear it, but you might be right.
Art Robinson, I don't know if you know who he is. He ran for Congress a couple times in Oregon against, I think he's from the 4th Congressional District, who is a socialist Democrat. But his kids are just all brilliant, and one of them was pursuing a doctorate in nuclear engineering, I believe, or he had some graduate project he was doing, and it was one year it was voted the best project in this whole science department, not just in the nuclear part. And the next year he was basically kicked out of the program because he wasn't making progress towards his doctorate. And the thing that nobody wants to talk about is this guy that he was running against for Congress. This kid's father was running against for Congress was a buddy. He's a good buddy with the president of the university, and he knew the person that was head of the department. And they just said, well, you're going to keep running, and your kid is out here talking to all the people in my department about, your dad or his dad, and we're just going to get him out of the program. So they just trumped up some stuff and got him out of there. It was just a sad story.
Yes, that is. That's very sad.
Oh. So there's still there's still sabotage going out there. Maybe it's for different things now. It's for political things, which is even worse. But yeah, it's okay. So
yes, I was fortunate because when I was at Upjohn, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
I was going to say, when I was at Upjohn, I ran as a libertarian, and thankfully they were pretty open-minded about it.
Yeah, it's and almost every libertarian I've ever met doesn't have a lot of respect for other views, because I think they've kind of discovered this special place and they really respect it. But at the same time, they don't tell people they don't have a right to those views. They just say, well, I don't really think that you've quite figured it out yet, or something. They try and find a nice way to tell them they're not interested. But I've never really come across a libertarian that wants to silence somebody else's voice. They, them. And the other two active political parties, that's pretty common.
Yes, well, I think that's because it's about power. And when it's about power, obviously you'll use government aggression, but, there's also an intimidation factor you're willing to employ, if you will, verbally, because, that's all about power. It's all about power. Whereas I think, I like to think at least of libertarianism as a philosophy that, is pretty much live and let live. And the idea is not to grab power and lord it over somebody else, either intellectually or physically. It's simply, a much more relaxed way of being, if you'd like to look at it that way.
Exactly. It's a relaxed way of looking at things. Sometimes I get a little frustrated, but that's because of my lack of being able to show people how much better freedom works. And books like your book are really important for educating people and for giving you examples of how much better the world could be if we didn't have the government slowing everything down. But I also wanted to put a plug in for a book I read, or actually it was an audio book that I listened to on a trip, and I liked it so much I bought the book, but I can't find it. It's in a box somewhere due to various moves that I made. It's John Stossel's book where he talked about the FDA in this book. I don't know if you ever heard or read that one.
I know there's one called America is Still Number One. And
no, before that.
And you can't do, you can't say that or
before that
around
one, I
those
think.
Lines.
Anyway,
Okay.
He was talking about an FDA official. He was talking about how bad government is and how badly it treats us. And an FDA official gets up and he's announcing this new drug has been approved and it's going to save 50,000 lives a year. And in the speech, he talks that this drug has gone through many trials. It's taken 20 years for this drug to get to the market. And I'm thinking, that's 1 million people died waiting for this drug. And
exactly.
And nobody else.
That's the downside.
Yeah, and John Stossel's pointing that out, and I was catching on right away when he started the story. I said, but I bet you very few people catch on to that. They think, oh, that's really great. If I get sick, there'll be that drug there for me. They don't feel any bad for the 1 million people that died waiting for it.
Exactly. And that's why, since we, the consumer, are the ones that have to die or live based on the decision that's made, that should be our decision. It's so simple and straightforward. I mean, nothing happens to the FDA commissioners or the people who examine the data and make the decision to ask for another study, for example. Nothing happens to them.
They have no economic consequence. They have no legal consequence, and their decision making is really tainted just because they can't learn from a bad decision. They just keep going. They just make another decision. They don't care. And even if they do care, like I said, it's impossible for them to really feel the economic loss that a really bad decision makes.
Well, not just economic loss. I'm writing a book about the FDA right now, and I calculate that 1 out of every 5 people who have died since 1962 have had their life shortened, just in the U.S. And if you think about that, that means each of us has a family member that has died prematurely because of the FDA. It's not just about money. It's about our friends and family. suffering needlessly and dying early needlessly. It's very sad.
Do you know very much about Dr. Joel Wallach?
No, I don't know. Don't know a whole lot about him, but I've heard his name.
He's a veterinarian, or he started out as a veterinarian, and he got a job doing a research project at a school in Georgia, and I don't recall the name, but they were trying to find treatments for cystic fibrosis, and they were working on monkeys, and he discovered that they were trying to induce cystic fibrosis into these monkeys, and he discovered that by keeping selenium out of their diet, they would develop it. And so he immediately ruled out that it could be a genetic cause, because you couldn't, now we call it epigenetics, but he said, well, if it was genetic, we wouldn't be able to turn it on and turn it off by nutrition. And so he published this paper, and we've cured cystic fibrosis. This was in 1968 or 69 or 67. It was a long time ago. And so for all he got, he published his paper. The university was real excited. And then all of a sudden he came to work one day, and they told him he was fired, and he never was able to ever work again as a veterinarian. He became a clinical pathologist and eventually a naturopathic doctor. And then he kept developing his theories about nutrition, and he's started a company called Longevity, and they make supplements and all this sort of stuff. But he estimates, and I listened to him talk in a talk, that he estimates that maybe close to 30 million children, or young teens, that's when they die usually, before they get to adulthood, have died since he made that discovery, because they just wouldn't let that information out. There's no money to be made by selling people selenium supplements.
Well, and that's true for a lot of, that's true for a lot of inexpensive preventative things. If you don't take selenium or whatever else you're trying to talk about that cures disease, and you don't take it through the FDA's process, then it's against the law for you to say anything about that to physicians. In other words, the only people who can go in a physician's office and tell them these things are pharmaceutical reps. And to tell you another story along these lines, of course, you probably, everybody today knows that fish oil is a good thing. It helps balance your eicosanoids or prostaglandins, which was actually, Upjohn was the thought leader in that area for a long time. So
that was one of your major areas of research, wasn't it?
That's right. So everyone's taking fish oil, and one enterprising pharmaceutical company decided that they would take fish oil and change it just a little bit chemically, so that they could get the patent, and they would, go ahead and do the studies the FDA required. And so they're the only company that can go into doctors' offices and say, our fish oil is the only oil, that has been FDA approved for these diseases. And the person who actually started the fish oil craze, Dr. Barry Sears, who actually came to Upjohn because he was interested in balancing the eicosanoids, and we were the thought leaders at that time. He's the one who's really put that out. He's the zone diet guy. Anyhow, he has developed a fish oil that is much purer. It has fewer PCBs than any of the other fish oils out there, including the prescription fish oil. But it's against the law for him to go to doctors and tell them, my fish oil, has less PCBs in it, because, he hasn't put it through all those hoops. And it's really sad that this prescription fish oil now costs so much money that when my sister checked into it, she found that she could buy, Barry Sears fish oil for the same amount of money that her copay would be for the prescription fish oil. So what the FDA wants to turn these inexpensive nutritional things into drugs. And in fact, there's been many cases where they've sent out warning letters to, like, the people who Diamond Walnut Company that produces walnuts, and the people who produce cherries, because they cited studies showing that the compounds that are in the walnuts and the cherries actually help prevent disease. But the FDA won't let them even put it on their website. It's amazing.
It really is. I'm wondering if these people in the FDA, if they realize that they're going to have to, there's going to be somebody that's a relative or in their immediate family at someday that's going to be taken prematurely because of their actions as well. Do they think they're immune to these things, or they think that they know more than everybody else? Do they really know what the inside scoop is, and they just, no one else can buy this, but I know that this is the best product, so I'm going to buy it?
Well, I tried to talk. I was at a seminar once where I gave a talk, kind of along the lines we're speaking about now, but in more scientific jargon. And I recognized that the people there from the FDA were having a very hard time even comprehending it was possible that what they were doing was hurting people. It was kind of like deer in the headlights. Now, there was one gentleman who got it. And he talked to me a little bit about coming into the FDA and sharing that information that never quite materialized. But, there are people in the FDA who get it. And I've got some quotes in Healing Our World from FDA commissioners, that say things like keeping a drug from the market to do more testing can be as dangerous as putting one out before the testing's done. They get that. At least some of them do. But for the most part, I don't think it's a concept that has ever occurred to them.
It doesn't seem so. It's easy to look back at all their failures and point fingers and stuff, and they're very good at the propaganda angle where they kind of self-promote themselves and try and show how it was kind of almost by accident that thalidomide wasn't approved in this country as fast as it was in Europe, and a bunch of children were born with birth defects due to that, and then they realized that it was a problem, but it never got on the market in the United States. And the person that was, maybe they were just inept or something, but they got an award for quote unquote keeping it off the market, and they just used that story just to, the FDA is protecting you from things like thalidomide. And this has been around since I was a kid. They've been talking about this.
Yes,
they haven't saved anybody from anything else ever.
Well, let's face it, all drugs have side effects, and the reason drugs get to market with side effects, other than the fact that they all have them, is that usually we don't know enough to keep them off. For example, when thalidomide came out, there really wasn't a very good understanding that the fetus is so much more sensitive to, than the mother would be to the drug. And in fact, the drug actually was saving lives. It was a safer sleeping pill than the barbiturates, which were actually killing a lot of people. So when they took it off the market with the thalidomide scare, I think people went back to dying from barbiturates for a while. And then they found out that thalidomide has some other properties. It's good against leprosy. It's actually helpful against certain cancers. So they've now brought it back, for these limited uses. And of course, I wondered too how long it would have, how much more quickly we would have had the life-saving effects of it if we were able to employ them sooner. But the bottom line is, if you take a drug, there's a risk, because these are powerful substances. And sometimes we don't know until many, many people take the drug what the worst side effects are. And in fact, if you think about thalidomide for a little bit, we've had an American thalidomide because of the changes in the regulations that were made because of thalidomide. And that's the folic acid for spina bifida. It's a B vitamin that helps prevent neural tube defects. We knew about it since the 1980s, but the folic acid manufacturers weren't allowed to tell young women that, if they were of childbearing age, they should be taking folic acid because you needed it very early in the pregnancy. And even when the Center for Disease Control and other government agencies started making that recommendation in the early 90s, the FDA still wouldn't let folic acid manufacturers tell young women about this. So depending on what estimates you use, you come out with around 20,000, 25,000 American babies were born with these defects, which are really bad, that you basically have to institutionalize the child and or abort them because you can test for it in the uterus. So that tragedy, that for that one B vitamin, was worse than thalidomide worldwide, which caused about 10,000 deformities.
Mm-hmm. I was briefly a chemistry teacher in Lincoln City, and one of my students was a thalidomide baby. His parents had been in the military, and he had been born. It was prescribed, because that's the only way Americans could get it, is if they were out of country. And he'd been prescribed it when his mom got pregnant there on the military base. And yeah, that was he was still an amazing kid. I mean, he could strap things on his arm and play piano, and ended up figuring out how to rig something up so he could drive. He was very smart. He was very he just did really well with his handicap. He was appointed chairman of a state commission on handicaps and by the governor, and when he was just out of high school. And he was an amazing kid. It wasn't. But I always remember him as wow, this was really sad. That what could he have done if he had real arms and hands? He just had two little stubs coming out of his shoulders.
Well, at least he had, right, at least the thalidomide kids, for the most part, had normal brains. But unfortunately, these children that were born with spina bifida or other neural tube defects often didn't. So, a much worse tragedy befell the country because of its overreaction to the thalidomide tragedy. And of course, Vioxx is the largest drug disaster in history. It happened under the FDA's jurisdiction after these new regulations were passed.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of movement going now that companies are trying to get natural vitamins banned as because they haven't proven their effectiveness, and they're trying to get synthetic vitamins patented so they can make money off of those, as they've been FDA approved, more or less like the fish oil.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's not just to make money, though, Chuck. In a way, I think some of these companies think that it won't be. I mean, at least when they get something like the prescription fish oil, somebody can go to the doctor.
Hello? Are you still there?
And it's silly because these substances are cheap. They're and we have the First Amendment in this country. You would think that we could say what we wanted to about vitamins. But in fact, the FDA does not believe that the First Amendment applies to commercial speech, and that is what it has been using to fight truthful claims for these inexpensive preventative substances.
Well, there's also this greater tragedy that occurs. People began to defer their own personal responsibility for their health and nutrition to a third party, in this case, the government. Yes. Or FDA. And there's no way that the government can look after 350 million people and their health and nutrition and do it effectively, or even do it partially well. It's too big a task. It's way too expensive. It just couldn't possibly be done. But people think that they have this illusion that they're being protected, and they really aren't.
That's right. And they, the doctors are, they don't get the kind of education, the broad-based education that you'd like them to in nutrition, because that education is pretty much dictated by the state licensing boards, and they've been pretty much co-opted by, the AMA and the idea of a particular way of thinking about medicine. So then you get into the situation where the doctors don't know about nutrition either. The pharmaceutical companies aren't going to really be able to develop these substances, which is sad because, the pharmaceutical companies were the first ones to really manufacture them and put them out, before the early 60s, before these regulations got put into place. the way you got your vitamins was from pharmaceutical companies, and that would have continued, I think, without the 62 amendments. So the whole system is all screwed up because of these amendments, which is why I'm writing a book about it. I'm about halfway through it, so hopefully next year sometime
can't wait for
you'll
this
have
one.
a chance to look at that. Yeah.
Since you brought up the AMA, the AMA is kind of closely tied to the Flexner report, which is something else I wanted to discuss because to me this is kind of the source of the problem, and you can't just change things. You have to kind of peel the layers back until you get down to the foundational things that were done to change how medicine is practiced in this country. And that report was probably it. Now, there were probably a lot of things in the report that were true and were, valid criticisms. But I think that his solutions were all kind of baked in the cake by the people that were paying him to go out and write this report. And that was the Rockefeller Foundation through the Carnegie Foundation. And he was appointed to this job because his brother Simon had a lot of influence with he was working for the Rockefeller Foundation, and so he goes off. Now this Abraham Flexner he was a pretty smart guy, I think. I just don't think he knew very much about medicine. He was considered an expert in education, although I have my doubts about that too. He did write a book that was pretty critical of some of the way things were being taught, and I think that he probably had some points in that just sitting down in a big lecture hall and listening to someone talk for 50 minutes was not as stimulating as maybe smaller groups being led in discussions by someone who's maybe an expert. I can see some of those things as being valid, but anyway, he went around to every single teaching school in America. It took him almost 2 years. And some of it, he had to travel on horseback to get to some of them. This was in 1910 or 1912. I think it was 1910. And he came out with pretty scathing reports about just about every medical teaching school out there except for one, which was Johns Hopkins, which was the university that was favored by the AMA. And the AMA had, for a long time, since just after the Civil War, they'd been campaigning to try and improve the lives of their member doctors. And they practice allopathic medicine, which is, pills, and they were good at doing things like setting broken bones and whatever. But they had some problems in that they had a higher death rate in their patients than like maybe naturopathic doctors or homeopathic. But not to say that they were all bad or the other ones were all good. They were just they were what they were. A lot of the teaching schools weren't very good, and they were kind of diploma mills. They were just there to generate money for the people that run the schools. They didn't really teach much. But I think all those things that were wrong with it, the market was taking care of it all by itself. We know that one of the statistics is the number of teaching schools had been reduced from 146 to 110 before he wrote his scathing criticism. So that's telling me that market forces were already fixing the problem until the next one came up. But his book, once it was published and they got people from the AMA to validate it and say this is what we need, and they went around to all the states in the United States. At that time there were 46, I believe, and soon there were 48 when Arizona and New Mexico came in a couple of years later. They went around to every state, and they got medical boards in those states to begin licensing doctors. And they would only license doctors that had been educated in AMA-approved universities. In those universities, they were all taught a curriculum that was dominated by information that came from the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, which were very closely related in those days. And they were trying to promote the use of pharmaceutical agents to cure people and things that they had patented and could make money on. So there was, it was just, that's that's the history that I'm pretty sure is fairly correct. At one time when we did my first show on this, I was a little more critical of Abraham Flexner. I thought he was much younger than he was when he went on this journey. He was I think he was over 40 years old when he went to do this. So he wasn't just a young man. He'd been around the block a couple times. Mm-hmm. But he definitely had very little or no medical experience. And he didn't understand what was being taught, and the methods that they were using in teaching may have been, sometimes people prescribe plants. I mean, you would think that's maybe barbaric or it's ancient. It's not new. We're in an industrialized age, and so he would complain about that. Well, the Chinese have been doing that for 4,000 or 5,000 years, and we're finding out that a lot of those herbs that they prescribe for people to eat work pretty well for a lot of things.
Well, and a lot of our drugs come from those plants.
Yeah. And so his lack of knowledge and understanding of that part of it probably is my main criticism of his work. It certainly did change how everything is done in this country, though.
Oh, yes. I mean,
it was like a 180-degree change, and suddenly there's a centralized authority. It's like central banking. We have central medicine. There's one organization that kind of controls and how everything is done. It's a private organization. It's not run by the government, but the government does have some influence over them. And they set up the curriculums at the schools that teach the things that reinforce what they're trying to do. And I'm not going to say they didn't make any progress. So, heck, we're doing what I consider to be miracles in medicine during my lifetime. But I think we'd have reached that point much sooner, and we'd be further ahead without this control. I just think there's a lot of really innovative things that are just being swept under the rug because it's not part of their stuff.
That's right, and they almost destroyed the chiropractic profession. I'm glad they didn't because, boy, I've utilized chiropractors for so many things that have been so helpful. I just wouldn't be as healthy as I am today without them. And, of course, belatedly, I think physicians, MDs, are recognizing that chiropractors actually do good work. And so that's heartening, but, we didn't need to almost put them out of business, and we did pretty much put the naturopaths and the homeopathy people out of business with those regulations.
I think there's only a few states where people can they can work as a naturopath these days. I think it's 17 or 18 states it's legal for them to practice medicine, and they can prescribe things and whatever. But the rest of the states they can't.
And what's so crazy is we really don't know as much science as most people think we do. There's so much we don't know about the body. Yeah. And one way to find out quickly, of course, is to have people pursuing different paths to see what works.
Right, and that's if you have different points of view or different ways of looking at things, you often can see something that someone else misses. And we could go into all sorts of different examples of that, but the other thing I wanted to point out on this is that you were talking about chiropractors. I have a personal example, and I know this is an anecdotal story. It doesn't prove anything, but chiropractors can't prescribe medicine by law. So they're very conscious about diet. When you have problems, you're starting to have problems with your joints and your spine and whatever. A lot of that is because you have a poor diet, and they often have incredibly good nutritional information and advice. And I went to see a chiropractor for high blood pressure, believe it or not. And he said, "You're gluten intolerant. I bet you $100 right now you're going to be gluten intolerant. But let's not waste the money on a bet or a test. Just stop eating all grains for a week and tell me how you feel, and we'll measure your blood pressure again." And man, in 3 days I felt amazingly well. And
that's fantastic. Yes,
I stopped taking my blood pressure medicine, and my blood pressure got below any time it had ever been while I was taking my medicine. And just because he was sure that was my problem, because I had the physical appearance of someone who was gluten intolerant. And my health is so much better. I had a lot of other little kind of chronic illnesses that weren't serious or life-threatening, but they weren't fun. And they all disappeared too. That's
fantastic. Yes. And yeah.
But that's something that almost was denied to anybody in this country. I mean, this man, he helps people all the time. he had a case history of one of his patients that was actually about ready to have amputations on his leg, and he managed to forestall that, and they got him off the grains. They got him starting to take better nutritional products. His type 2 diabetes calmed down. He started to feel better. He could get up out of the chair again and started to walk, and they started to jog, and he ran in a 10K race about 6 months after he had started this program. And they went back to the doctor, and there was no sign of diabetes anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, without chiropractor, he'd be dead.
Yes.
I'm sure.
Yes. So yes, there's so much information out there, and to squash it or to relegate it to a minor role is silly, because there's so much we don't know. The human body is still a great mystery.
Yeah, it is, and I think I had I don't believe entirely in genetics, but I do believe that because my biological father was born in Finland. And I have a lot of genes that don't really do well with, I don't have a lot of the enzymes I think it takes to break down grains in my system. And so as I grow older, the ones that I did have, they kind of vanish. So I was, from probably about age 35 on, I was having problems. Mm-hmm. And I probably wouldn't have made it to 77, which is the average time of death for people in this country without my chiropractor's help. And now I'm shooting for about 120.
Good for you.
I feel awesome.
And that's really something I hope your listeners are taking home, is that there's a lot of things you can do with nutrition. When I was at Upjohn, it was before the time when you could genetically manipulate animals. And we found it actually was very tough to make our rats sick, because we had titrated their diet, and given them everything they needed, and they just were so healthy. So what we had to do to make them sick so we could try our drugs out on them is we had to take away some of their nutrients. And depending on what we took away, we'd get a different disease.
Right.
So this is a little hint, that nutrition is very important. And if you get it right, if you get nutrition right, you can be remarkably healthy. And one of the stumbling blocks we have as human beings is, of course, we don't generally do full-blown experiments on ourselves, even for diet. But when you have a situation like yours, Chuck, and somebody tells you to try to go down a different road for a while, and you do, and you feel better, well, then that's for you. So I think if there's one message I'd like your listeners to take away, is that diet is very important. The amount of nutrition you get is very important. And unfortunately for each of us, as you were mentioning, genetics determine a lot of what that is for us. So we have to kind of experiment a little and see what works for us.
Yeah, and it's someone, I don't know if this was, I think this was a pharmacist, Ben Fuchs, on one of his podcasts. He compared the human body to a copy machine. He says, if you don't get the right nutrition, think of that as toner. If it's not there, then you stop making your copies correctly. They're not all there. There's parts of it that are missing, and so then you start having disease and cancers and things like this. And so the nutrition is so important to your body to keep functioning. And I thought that was a pretty good metaphor, I guess is the right term, it's an analogy, I guess. I always get those mixed up. But it's to show us as how the body is continually reproducing its cells all the time, and if you don't, it needs a lot of nutrition to do that correctly.
Oh yes, it does. So
you should be taking probiotics so you get a good breakdown of your food, and make sure that you eat balanced diets, and try not to eat too much in the food desert in the middle of the store. Go around the outside rim, because that's where all the fresh food is, and that's where all the nutrition is. If they have to,
that's right.
Yeah, so those are just basic things, but it's also sometimes, depending on where you live, you can live on a farm and grow your own, but if you don't have the right nutrients in your soil, you could also come up deficient and stuff. So it doesn't hurt to take a supplement just to kind of cover all your bases.
Sure, and it's important how you balance your proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, too. And again, Barry Sears I think, got the best best program for that. So
that's the Zone Diet guy, right?
Zone Diet,
Yeah.
And his website is drsears.com. So your listeners would want to check that out.
I think a lot of people should check it out. We spend more on healthcare in this country than anybody else in the world, and we have the sickest people in the world because they eat crap. They need to really take responsibility for their own health and their own well-being. We wouldn't have a healthcare crisis if people were healthier.
That's right. And there's some very easy things you can do to be healthier, but most people aren't taught that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think most people, they learn all their health advice from TV, from a commercial or they'd use deceptive slogans or little cliches about this and that.
Mm-hmm. Well, if your listeners want to go to a place, I think, that has very good scientific information, but it's put forth in a way that the layperson can understand and deals with both nutrition and drugs, I really recommend the Life Extension Foundation.
That sounds like a great one. Just a great name.
Yeah, lef.org. It's run by a couple libertarians, actually. And they actually were the only, or maybe the first nutritional company to fight the FDA and win.
I think actually they may have been the first, but that Dr. Wallach, who I brought up before, I think he's beat them in court 8 times.
Good for him. Well, good for him. I'll have to look. I've heard his name before. I wasn't aware.
He's pretty controversial. He's been kind of keeping his head down for a long time, and I think he's just gotten tired, and he's older now. Maybe he's a little crankier. So he just lets him have it, both barrels, sometimes when he speaks. And it's pretty refreshing to see someone just say, look, they're killing people. We need to stop this.
Yes, and he's right. That's exactly right. And I guess that's another message. We often think that if regulation is put in place, it will help us. But actually, the title of my new book is going to probably be Death by Regulation, because that is exactly what happens. When you take choice away from individuals, it's truly a matter of life and death.
Another way to say that, which probably isn't as, what you said was perfect, but for the people who want just a quick phrase they can toss back at somebody and say, if you have to use force to enact something, it probably isn't a very good idea.
That's right. And, when Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death, he was thinking, I'm sure, of the redcoats and a firing squad taking his life. But frankly, the regulators do it a little every day. So that's really an image.
The words just before that.
If you don't have liberty. Mm-hmm.
The words just before that were, is life so dear, peace so sweet, to be purchased with chains from our necks to our feet.
Yeah. And you know what? But it's a lot of people today think they should give up liberty for security. But actually, if you give up liberty, you're quite literally giving up your life.
Yep. Well, we are at the end of the program. This has been awesome. I was thinking we could get into vaccinations and all these other things, and this was too interesting to change course, so I just got on with it. You'll have to come back and be on the show again sometime, maybe when you get this other book done, and we'll talk about vaccination world, because it's hard to find people with your scientific background that have